right. In the meantime, we are honored to present our last, but definitely not least speaker, Bart de Witte. Bart de Witte helps the healthcare sector navigate the difficult or intricate balance between AI's potential benefits and the pitfalls it poses to healthcare accessibility, as already referenced by the minister in his speech. Bart joined or founded the Hippo AI Foundation after a successful career at IBM. The Hippo AI Foundation is a non-profit based in Berlin, committed to championing open source AI for the healthcare sector. Bart's influence really extends globally, as witnessed by prominent positions within the WHO and I should check, the UN Office of the Secretary General. So please join me in welcoming Bart to the stage. You're already here.
Yeah, I'm going to stand here. So thank you. I'm sorry I'm going to stand here because I have 90 slides. And this goes better when I stand in front. I'm really happy to be back in Belgium. I was born here, I was raised here, but I left 26 years ago. And I also have to congratulate you because I live in Germany. And Germany always has this thing with being Weltmeister. And I think Belgium is now being the Weltmeister of a health data agency because you are faster than Germany. So congratulations on that. And I'm really impressed with the presentation. I'm looking forward to see more to come. As mentioned, I switched my career from being a global IBM executive to being suddenly a non-profit founder. That has to do with my background, having witnessed IBM Watson, which was one of the, or Watson Health, which was one of the first global endeavors to bring AI into global health systems. And I also had, I'm largely influenced of working in Africa and in Eastern Europe, but also in the US, seeing different health systems and especially inequalities in health. Which is why I chose this image of Roy Ikeda, which is a Japanese artist, because I think when we digitize, we need to see, as Minister Frank van der Broeke told already, that we don't increase inequalities, but also build based on our norms and principles. A first disclaimer, when I talk about AI, I know this is a wide field. I'm not going to differentiate between the different methods. The second thing, when I talk about open source AI, it is really complicated, but let's call it just open source AI. But there's a data component, there's a code component, and there is a weight file component. A very short commercial part from my side. So what do we do with Hippo AI? It's named after Hippocrates. We try to build open health ecosystems and bridge open science with open source for the industry, because I believe in Europe, we don't need big corporates. We need small and medium enterprises that flourish in each region so we can distribute wealth based on our economy. And I think open systems are faster in innovation and accelerating, and I think we can be competitive. This year or last year, I'm still in 23, we started building our global community. We have a Discord server, we're serving them with services. And we are building up a large global community to accelerate the work on open sourcing medical AI, this community, our researchers, but also people within the industry. My first act of today is bringing me back to what I've been doing in the last 4 years, is really looking into social theory and into philosophy, because digitalization is always looked at something being very simplified. Yeah, we talk about Spotify or we talk about Uber, but what are the consequences? And one of my influences was the social theorist that lectures at the LMU Munich, Armin Nasehi. And he mentioned in his theory of digitalization something that caught me, because he mentioned that digitalization is nothing else as a duplication of the world through data. And when you think about this and you think about what we have been doing with predictive models, then yes, we are starting building predictive or duplications of weather systems, or we do this when we duplicate CT images to build 3D models to predict how the heart looks like, so the surgery can have already a feeling prior to doing surgery. Or this little bastard, the COVID virus, we start to simulate and predict behavior. Or the human proteome that was developed by DeepMind with AlphaFold, which then duplicated the whole proteome, the human proteome, and shared it into a public database. And then we start building models to see how these proteins that we synthesize then bind with molecules. So we are always duplicating real-world situations and turning that into a duplication, and data is always the core. And to simplify this in a sense that helps you to better understand what we actually are doing, because the other one that influenced me was Professor Jürgen Habermas, who is a philosopher in Germany, who in the 60s wrote his theory of the structural change of the public sphere, where he predicted when we start moving communication to the private sphere that suddenly our communication will be influenced by private interest and political interest. And if you look at today's discussion about social media, you already feel that our conversations are being influenced. So what happens when we duplicate our health data from the public sphere, public health systems, into what we then call the digital sphere, and where we are protecting in the public sphere our rights with human rights, but in the digital sphere turning that into terms and conditions which are governed by law. What are the complications of that? And when I switched here, when we then duplicate, we need then to ask the question, what kind of a duplication do we need? Because I have the feeling that in my world, perhaps I'm a bit biased, that we start to duplicate the world of Silicon Valley. And everybody who has been there in the latest time knows that it looks like a bit dystopian when you look at the street. Equality is not something that comes for given there, and healthcare in the US is based on very different norms, values, and principles. We have not only the right to privacy that we protected with GDPR, but we also have the right for care, which is protected by Article 35 in our European fundamental rights, which surprises me is a right that is not even mentioned in the proposal for the European health data space. There is no mention at all about this right to healthcare. So we have different principles. So I think when we build healthcare, we should start building based on these principles and start talking about digital rights. And that's something that has been keeping me very busy lately. The second part of my presentation talks about value. I really, having worked for the industry, I have the feeling that a lot of people don't really understand what we really do when we turn data and capitalize it. I'm not an anti-capitalist at all, but capitalize it and turn it into an asset. And a lot of people that I have friends and I work with a lot of physicians, they don't have an economical background and they don't know the difference between intangible assets and commodities. So I'm going to do a very smart introduction into these concepts because I think it is important to start talking about what are the differences here, what are the consequences. What are the consequences when we share our data, use mostly open science-based algorithms, and then use compute power and turn that into what we then call a trained AI model and protect that with trade secrets and turn that into an intangible asset. Because that's what we actually are doing when we are using healthcare in the private industry to start protecting this. So we are turning that into what we then call assets. And mostly these are then private assets protected by IP, like an IP is a wide term. Most specific, it's trade secrets because there's no ownership on data, so you try to hide access. And there is a difference between commodities because some people tell that data is a commodity. Commodity is oil. And data is not oil. Data is not a commodity. Data is becoming an asset. And the value of assets, these intangible assets, is derived by the future potential earnings. So it's kind of taking a mortgage on the future income of owning such assets. This is why you see then suddenly startups like Flatiron, which was a cloud-based oncology patient record, like for oncologists, that used a similar business model as WhatsApp, telling these oncologists, hey, we have a really amazing oncology health record, you can use it for free. What happened? 2 million patient records were stored. The startup got an investment of 300 million and then was sold for 2.1 billion 4 years later to Roche in Switzerland. So that's what you can imagine they don't have an income, they don't have revenue streams, and then you pay 2.1 billion for having access to 2 million data sets that you make exclusive. Jennifer Hinkle, a person I work with in the US, then in Stat News, formulated quite well because, yes, these are intangible assets, and the value is based on the projected future value and success of that data. So data is not oil, data is not a commodity in that sense, but it's an intangible asset. And with these intangible assets, there is something really weird that goes on, because mostly with intangible asset, the price goes up when the demand goes up. But commodities, it's different. When you have more demand, you can have higher supply, and then the price drops. And I give you a few examples. In the US, insulin, which was patented 100 years ago, where the inventor, a Canadian physician, told, "This is my gift to the world, I sell it for $1 to Eli Lilly," was then captured with IP and protected for over 100 years. And in the last 2 decades, the price increased by 1,200%. Yes, there was incremental innovation, but also it led to last year 100,000 diabetes, or like partly led to 100,000 diabetes dying in the US because they couldn't afford insulin anymore. That's what happens when you own an intangible exclusive asset. You start increasing price because you have obligations to your financial markets to have increase on your shares of profits. The same thing, a lot of scientists in the room, they know that when you work with scientific publishers, how did the prices increase? These are public paid, tax-paid research papers where then the publishers take the copyrights and are able to increase the price of scientific publishing. So intangible assets in healthcare and in science have this tendency to really not support our common goals when it comes about giving everybody access to healthcare. So I propose a third option, like let's make public intangible assets. And public intangible assets is something different than private assets, because public intangible assets, they belong to all of us. This is about collective ownership. This is about licensing, using open source licenses, so we can start using that without barriers. I said last week that we used to stand on the shoulders of giants. That's what Newton at least said when we developed science. But we start to be standing on the shoulders of lawyers and paywalls. And I don't think that is something that really evolves healthcare in a very good direction. Is this possible, people said to me. And I said, like, well, let's look in history. And I never thought that I would give this person, during my speech, the honor to talk. But in 2000, something amazing happened when the human genome got sequenced, which is also a duplication of the world through data. It's data that is being sequenced. And Tony Blair said, following during a press conference, that he co-joined with Bill Clinton, who was holding the press conference in the US.
We, all of us, share a duty to ensure that the common property of the human genome is used freely for the common good of the whole human race.
So they created policies that turned the human genome into a public common good, or a public asset, intangible asset. And it lets people then tell, how does the economy can earn money? Well, research and show by opening it up, you created $1 trillion of economical value. It is not because we give open access that all economical opportunities disappear. What you do is you avoid monopolism, which is probably the reason why genome sequencing is one of the only technologies I've seen in healthcare that completely followed Moore's law and always went cheaper. We talked about proton therapy, that goes up in price, but sequencing technology became super cheap. So investing in open science in a joint layer really accelerates innovation, but also serves the industry. Now, there is something weird with openness, because if you start sharing and the other doesn't share, then you are confronted with what's called the Matthew effect, the paradox of openness, or in game theory, the prisoner dilemma. Because if you share and the other doesn't share, the one who doesn't share always wins. You can simulate this. And I experienced this as well with my experimentations that we were doing with the foundation. And I started then thinking further because, yeah, well, when we have now the European health data space in our public systems and we shift data to the data economy in that private sphere to create economical value, what will happen with the social value that we get out of that data? And I believe if we don't change our thinking about data and we follow data capitalistic views and starting looking at data as a private asset that you can protect, then it's going to be really difficult to extract social value, just like we have seen with insulin, which the social value was not really there anymore in that sense. So looking at data, the economy in that sense, we need to start rethinking. And also in that private sphere, there are data pools that we don't even discuss in the European health data space. Like the data that we get from wearables that is hosted in the Apple cloud, or we have a lot of digital health startups that receive money just like Flatiron did. We have meta companies that are protective about their data, and most of them don't want to even share data. There was, based on the European health data space, a policy paper pushed by a lobby group that said like, only 10% of all the health data is being protected by IP. It needs to be 100%. Well, if that's 100%, data will never be accessible anymore. Just similar to Twitter, who recently kept the API that researchers don't get access to that data anymore. And I think we need to ask these questions before we can't access the data. Because I was at the JP Morgan conference a few years ago, and there was a very honest Goldman Sachs analyst who told, well, is really curing disease, is that really a business model we should follow up on? So if data within the private sphere is showing that we can cure diseases, but that data is not accessible, are we going to have access to that data or not? And these are really important questions. I don't believe I worked 20 years for the industry that you will easily get access to that data. What we see as well is the price of data going up, especially now with AI hype. We see the New York Times case with OpenAI where suddenly they start talking, you have to pay for copyright. So that discussion will always increase that narrative that data equals capital, and if that happens, and if data equals capital, data accumulations will follow capital concentrations. And they are not in Belgium, they're not in Germany, they're on the West Coast, California. And what happens then when we concentrate that data and are dependent and lose our sovereignty? I think these are extremely important questions that I don't see too much questions being asked. And I know I'm very provocative asking those questions, but I have children and I want them to grow up in a future that is more prosperous and more progressive as what we have seen today. Because I don't believe that that system is sustainable. I also didn't make friends when I was in Geneva a few years ago at the AI for Good conference, which was supported by this large tech company that managed for 92% of the European population. When we search something, what we find, you all know who I'm talking about. They were proposing the AI system that they developed in India, where they were doing ophthalmologic screening for diabetic retinopathy. And then they say like, wow, this is what we do. And we also discovered cardiovascular disease predictions out of that data, and we could see this and that. So I asked 3 questions, and I said like, did you ask for broad consent? Was the data being shared with the Indian research community, and was the AI model being open sourced? I didn't got answers, so I then said like, well, is that not a repetition of a colonial agenda? And whoa, I got never invited to that conference anymore. But I didn't care, because I think it's important to really ask and challenge these systems. They are extractive and they don't support our human or our values and norms. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but Google released suddenly a new large language model which is really performing well. But then in Nature magazine, they write, we are democratizing medicine. None of what they have developed is democratized. But they're using democratized, but they mean democratizing access, but based on their terms and conditions. If you close this down, this is for me more like a feudal system instead of a democratic system. And I was surprised that Time magazine was like really celebrating the AI by the people and for the people project in India. And I said like, well, where is the of the people? A democracy is based, according to Lincoln, by the people, for the people, but also of the people. This is a public asset. This is not a feudal system where we are happy to be on a platform and can be deplatformed, whatever the terms say. And they sell this under the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And, well, we have SDG 3, which is good health, but you cannot look at SDG 3 and say, I give you good health, but I extract all other value. That's what we used to do when we had our missionaries in Southern Africa or in the US. That's not sustainable. That's not what we want to do and repeat. And so if you look at these systems, they are extractive systems. And there is a huge risk if we don't set the European health data space, and I really celebrate the Health Data Agency, but don't set up a system of incentives for the industry that is based on openness and sharing, then it could well be that we have a transgression of norms, principles, and values that looks more like the US healthcare system as our European. And I'm a proud European, and I think we do that better. So in setting up my foundation, which is quite challenging when you're not Bill Gates and setting up a non-profit and you want to stay independent, being as outspoken as I am, you want to be not being biased by the funding you get. We started to look at how do we get this funded and how is the solution looking like? How do we, and that's the main important thing, how do you create incentives? Because I received grants from a pharmaceutical company when we did a data donation project. I was surprised, hey, you want to give me grants for open sourcing? Yes, we want these things to be open. And then the project kind of didn't got funding anymore. I said, like, yeah, well, if we open too much, well, a competitor is going to profit from this. So this is the prison dilemma, the Matthew effect, the paradox of openness. So we created a new concept called regenerative AI, looking at data ecosystems, just like we look at our ecosystems, our environmental ecosystems. And we have been, in the last decades, looking at how do we solve climate change, how do we create economical systems that are not extractive, that are sustainable. And in that same fashion of the regenerative economy, we created the concept regenerative AI. And we believe that these principles, which are based on data solidarity, but also digital commons and licensing, could then lead to data being something as a flow that doesn't serve only one sphere, but all the spheres, so we can start going further in innovation, accelerate innovation, but also serve everyone. So we have been looking into data ownership, into data production, into the models of IP and licensing, and we oppose the regenerative AI to something what we call extractive. And based on these principles, we want to measure data and AI ecosystems and start benchmarking these systems, and then connecting them to the ecological, social governance scoring models that are being mandatory implied by the European Union in 2025. Every company in Europe, larger companies who has a financial statement, will need to publish their impact on the environment, but also a social impact. So if that search company or OpenAI then suddenly extracts all the data and tells we are sustainable, then say, no, that's pretty asocial, so we're going to score you really bad. And then we can, something which is controversial, then sell certificates, just like carbon certificates, and with this money, we can finance open source. That's at least the state where we are at the moment. People tell me open source doesn't really work. I had a huge, one of my most exciting battle discussions with the CEO of Roche, which is one of the best paid CEOs, and he thought I was a communist, because mostly when you come with these open source things, you take it first that you are an anti-capitalist. I said, no, I'm a European, and we think about social values and economical values in both ways. And open source is really interesting because they are bottom up. It's not because people are financed that people start to work. It's about purpose. And it's about collaboration across barriers. And I always make this joke that the moment the Chinese, the Russians, and the Europeans and the Americans going to start collaborating is when this happens. That starts threatening to destroy us. Well, we had it a few years ago. It was called COVID. And there are so many research papers that show that during COVID that open science was really saving lives. The fact that we had so quickly a vaccine on the market was based on open science, was based on open data sharing, was based on open principles. So why don't we continue based on this? Now, in the healthcare sphere, the AI sphere where I'm at home, I was witnessing a year ago this conversation at the Technical University in Munich, and we were challenging this person that everybody knows, and he then asked following.
How many of you would like us to open source GPT-6 the day we finish training it?
Everybody raised their hands.
Wow. Well, we're not going to do that.
So that's the way how you build open source movements. You challenge, this is the Death Star for us. And the whole transformer models was based on, just a minute, there's a bit delay.
How many?
So, was based on a paper called Attention is All You Need. And Attention is All You Need was also an open publication by Google. One of the co-authors is my mentor, Jakob Uskoreit. And you saw during years a few research papers, but then in 2021 and 2022, within the private sector, what you see on the bottom, you saw a lot of developments, and there was GPT-3, first 1, 2, 3, and then there was ChatGPT that came up. And then in 2023, when Sam Altman said we're going to close everything, what you see on the top level, you saw suddenly a counter movement. You saw many, many people uniting in telling, well, what they can do, we can do as well, and we're going to build based on open source. And that community, there's no number on it, but has been accelerating innovation in a speed I haven't seen in my whole career. It started in July 22 with a global open, it was Big Science. I like the name Big Science because it's kind of countering big tech, with a paper that the first 4 pages only have authors. Like we have 45,000 researchers in Europe that all are focusing on machine learning, and OpenAI had less than 500 researchers and we couldn't find an answer. I think we need to rethink our alignments and incentives. Open source made also, in the last few years, the development much cheaper. Because, well, we don't, if you want to democratize, you want to make models that everybody can run at home. So more people that get access, the more innovation will happen. And that's what really happened. Like in just 2 years' time, the foundation models that we use, the large language models that we use, decreased nearly 89% in size. Transparency and alignment. Of course, open source is more transparent because you can get access to everything, nearly. There are different gradients, I know. Like some only publish the weight files. Some people, like Bloom, published everything. The data governance model, all the documents are accessible. And when Stanford in June published then the statistic, well, Bloom was the most compliant model on the index for being compliant with the EU Act, which then led to the surprise when in October they published again an index. And I said, like, well, there's quite a lot of lobbying when OpenAI can tell that for 50% they are open where they are not open at all, and suddenly end up in a transparency index being kind of okay. That's a transparency index defined by Schrödinger. That has nothing to do with transparency. Nobody can get access to these things. It was also criticized in a paper that giving 50% for a company that protects everything with trade secrets is absolutely distorting, and they called it transparency washing. Open source is also something different than what big companies do. It's incremental. Like that means that you have 200 scientists publishing on GitHub on their papers and sharing, and then you see all these little steps of people contributing. So what the anti-open source lobbyists were starting to do is trying to make every single researcher liable for sharing their work. Well, if you do that, nobody's going to share anymore because you're liable for dual use. Or what they also started to do is, yeah, well, you're not liable if you certify it. But I come from the healthcare side. If you go through a certification process of 200 steps and you have to pay 100,000 euros each step, you kill the whole open ecosystem. But it led to the democratization. And I already met a few people yesterday, and I'm totally baffled about what happened because I have on my iPhone now a model that I can access where my phone is on flight mode. I'm not connected to the internet. And it's 100% offline. And I can do exactly some sort of what ChatGPT is doing. So I put it offline. I have it also on my laptop. And Peter Dorger, who is a Belgian surgeon, is also using it. He said, like, this is the absolute freedom. I can ask questions. Yes, these models are not perfect. We need to work on architecture, hallucinations. All these things are a problem. But I have a 3 gigabyte file on my phone that has all the data of the internet available, and I can ask questions. I can translate them in my mother tongue to German, in French. I can do all these things, but I'm not being exploited with my data. I'm independent from any big tech. It's on my phone. I've served this to a lot of physicians, and they say, like, this is a dream for us. Because I can just upload patient data without having to worry. It's on my phone. Yeah, these things are very early stage. And out of these open source models, startups are being created. And I heard Minister van den Broeke talk about the workforce. And on that moment, I took my laptop and I entered this slide. So I hope I'm allowing to show, but it's going to take 2 minutes more of my presentation. But it shows you what you can do with large language models. It's not always about clinical decision support. But this is about a startup that used an open source model from Mistral AI. And it's a French startup, so the person speaking English has a French dialect in his English. And that's what the conversation is about.
Hello, what's bringing you here today?
So I've been having back pain for about 2 weeks now.
All right.
So it
when
transcribes.
started exactly?
So started about 2 weeks ago, and it's just been constant since then.
Okay, and have you had this before?
No, it's the first time.
First time. Any event that could have triggered this, like a gardening or moving furniture?
Nothing significant, nothing more than I normally do, but I guess we have tried.
I will accelerate this now.
Things at home and things, so
Because this is a 30-minute conversation.
All right. And so that's it. So I can just click on any consultation here.
So what it does, it takes the whole transcribed language and structures this. First, it recognizes which voice is the patient, which voice is the physician. It tells I have hay fever. And then you can look at the notes, and it structures this in clinical concepts. And you can export this into a fire export or whatever. Now, if you think about a workforce, and you look at how many times people are using their keyboards, we have to eliminate keyboards. But we also have to talk about who runs these technologies, because if we let them run by a company who is interested in capturing that data, then we will fall in the same trap. Just as a demo. What I'm surprised as well is how big these communities have become. Models are being downloaded 2.6 million times a month. That's download, that is not usage, that's download. And also what surprised me, well, it didn't surprise me because I come from the industry, is that there is a huge force against us, against the success of open source. And Jan Le Cun became my friend. I didn't like Meta. He's the head of AI research at Meta, Facebook. But he's also French. And the French have some kind of specific ideals when it comes to the enlightenment and freedom of science. And Jan said following.
Sadly, in the industry, there are people who are lobbying governments to actually make the open sourcing of large-scale LLM illegal. I'm very much in favor of a future with open-based models.
So, and how do you want to make it illegal? Well, by creating what we call bogus science propaganda, so releasing research papers that are published and funded by an open philanthropy think tank, where the owner of the think tank is also the investor of Anthropic AI, which is a startup that is funded with 3 to 5 billion from Google and Amazon. So you start creating fear, catharsis. It really works well because, a language model can suddenly create a bioterror weapon, which is in that paper absolute bogus because nobody in that paper used Google search to do the same, but somebody did the same and then came to the same results. Nobody talks that Google search is dangerous. Language models are not, and open sourcing are not dangerous. And that particular study was about the Spanish flu virus. It didn't talk about that in 2019, what was it? In 1998, the whole sequence code of that virus has been published. No barrier happened in that sense. And I think closing things up is more dangerous. I'll give you an example. There is a communication technology based on closed source algorithms for encryption that has been used for 20 years in all military, in all police, and in all ambulance communication in Europe. It's called Tetra. It's closed source. A few months ago, a Dutch research group found that there was a deliberate backdoor in that algorithm, that somebody could listen in all that communication, and it wasn't discovered for 20 years. Now, what is more dangerous, open source or closed source? There is no argument against that. And I give the word again to my friend Jan.
And the internet became a global infrastructure, completely delocalized, runs entirely on open source software. AI has to be the same way. AI will become a common platform and will have to be open source in particular, because that's the only way that we can have people around the world contribute to training it so that it becomes a repository of all human knowledge. You know, I'm taking the French government because I've talked to them quite a bit, but the French government will not accept that every citizen's interaction with the digital world is entirely controlled by a few companies on the west coast of the US. It's just too dangerous.
I completely agree. And France has developed a startup called Mistral AI that is now on my iPhone. But if I ask it who invented the French fries, it's the French. So we need a Belgian model for this. Even though it's open sourced. Coming back to COVID and my closing notes, there are so many papers out there that prove that openness and sharing was really accelerating life-saving innovation. We have seen this rubber band effect. That means that we are letting go and are back to the old state of building walls. I live in Berlin. We don't like walls. It took us 34 years to break that wall. I think walls in healthcare and in science are not really good. And I'm all for regulation in AI, but what they try to do is to regulate research and development, like sharing code. That's completely nonsense if we allow this to happen. We managed to convince the German government, the Italian and the French government to block in the AI Act a passage where they wanted to make researchers liable for sharing code. That means that only the big corporates who can afford the legal liabilities are allowed to build AI. We need to regulate on an application level, not on an R&D level. And I hope Belgium, who is now heading the European presidency, is also perhaps contributing to that. I've made policy recommendations. I think we need licenses for data, copyleft licenses. I think in Germany, there was a fund of 100 million for a tech sovereignty fund where they are funding open source developments. In the German coalition contract, there was a sequence, public money, public code. That means that all public developments with tax money need to lead to open source developments. And I also think that in the European Health Data Space proposal, we need to include our European right to healthcare and access. I cannot believe it's not in there. We have 32 times the name privacy and GDPR, but 0 times that exclusive right that makes us Europeans. So with this said, let's break down those walls and not build them. And when we share, let's do it in a regenerative way. And let's collaborate, because at the end, it's about saving the lives of billions. So thank you for your attention. Oh, I'm a bit over time, I think. No?
Okay. Thank you, Bart, for this definitely eye-opening speech. I already see a first candidate for a question, so yes.
Good morning. Thank you, Bart, for your nice presentation. I would like to thank you for promoting open source. Yes, it's important, open data, open source. But I keep in mind your slide where you put data, models, and computing power. And then on the bottom, you've got knowledge. And knowledge is very important. Most of us are scientists. But there's something which is coming, which is very important. You can promote open data. You can promote open models, AI. But if we don't have the power to compute and produce knowledge, it's a risky situation. I see all the major actors in the world putting a lot of effort in having a lot of power to compute and process data. And what is really missing in Europe is the ability to have huge infrastructure, also to be able to power all this massive data that we have because it's there. And I will also add a slide in your presentation about the fact we need open infrastructure to be able to process data.
Thank you very much for bringing this. I absolutely agree. I'm not going to counter anything. I also believe that the European Union is working on that they are releasing funds. There's also an initiative to build what we call the European CERN, like the CERN in Geneva for AI. There are ideas around it, and the reason why we are in this situation is because we missed open sourcing the infrastructure part. Like we open source software, we open source the internet, and then we allowed cloud and mobile to happen in a very closed model. So yes, it's not perfect, but we need to get there. And that I have a model running on my phone without having access to a cloud service already shows that for me the future, as these models get always more efficient, will be partly as well a decentralized mode, and training a model gets exponentially cheaper. Like I trained my first model using a convolutional neural network in 2017, and I paid $4,000 for compute power. I could do the same now for $5. So in that sense, there are some positive evolutions, but it's not perfect, and I absolutely agree we need a public infrastructure for getting access to compute power. The Bloom case I mentioned, which was by Big Science, received public funding from the French government, and they have one of the top 5 supercomputers, JC, in Paris, and they donated 5 million on compute power, value in 5 million euros, compute power for free for the open source community. And I think we need to find mechanisms to get funding. Not only public access, but also mechanisms through foundations. The last remark, when I started my foundation, I said, like, it's kind of ridiculous that we are such have such troubles to finding ways to fund this, when then a foundation like Médecins Sans Frontières, which I really love what they're doing, but you know how much funding they get in donations annually? Does anybody know this? $2 billion a year. Now with $2 billion, you can train a lot of things. So why don't we create similar foundation structures where people contribute for the common good? Does that answer your question? Oh yeah, it was not a question, but it was a remark. Yes, there is here.
Dirk Brooks, thank you for your presentation, and I really liked lots and almost all of the ideas that you proposed. One thing that struck me is, for instance, a tool like Nabla. If I see it working here, even in the condition it is, it should be part of a toolbox for every doctor, for instance, and it isn't. So my remark or my question really is, isn't the open models that you're proposing maybe lacking one aspect, and that's open marketing? I mean, the marketing of the commercial products are probably a lot stronger because they invest and they get a return on investment on it. And I see that maybe that's lacking a little bit in a lot of the ideas, a lot of the models that you have been proposing.
Thank you for allowing me to differentiate. Nabla is a commercial startup with a lot of funding that used Mistral AI, so they don't have to use an API from OpenAI or something, can do this independently. But the application layer is nothing open sourced in that sense. So I believe that in Belgium, where everybody has a patient record, one could think that perhaps you could create, based on open source development, you could create a patient app where the patient, wherever he goes, puts that on the phone, and then automatically it lands up structured in his patient record, and we turn everything around. There are many ways to implement this, but please differentiate between open source is R&D. It is not application. So we don't need marketing for R&D. Yes, we need marketing in the community and contribute, but we don't want to put things into application. That's part of the industry, or others, the government, who can do that. But it's really important to differentiate this, because the AI Act really tries to regulate the R&D part, and that's going to take the freedom of science away, because some people want to even define which training data sets we can use for language models, and then as well kind of censor certain information. So there's a lot of politics being involved there, but like research needs to be free, open, accessible. But true, we need way more marketing about open source, and I heard there was an Health Data Academy coming up, so I propose I can share my knowledge there, because I think there's much more knowledge to be shared about open source. It is not communism, it is an accelerator for innovation, and it helps small and medium enterprises to collaborate. It's a shared R&D layer, but it's definitely nothing that is going to destroy our economy in the country. No questions anymore? Everybody's hungry. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bart. Before I let you go, there are a few things, a few next steps that we would still like to share with you. Some of it has been already explained by Sophie, but it's my duty to tell you again. So as a first next meeting, there's a governing board on the 24th of January. People involved will probably already know that since it's next week. There will also be a user board on the 7th of March, and we will set up working groups as suggested by the user board. We also expect the nomination of a leading official, but as said, Sophie is on board as the interim leading official until then. Team will also be recruited, and the positions will be posted on the newly launched HDA website, so hda.belgium.be. And today also the HDA Academy has been launched with some basic modules. So this will be extended with expert modules, and I've already heard some great suggestions for future content today. And also a first data catalog with about 89 data entries. So we have come to the end of this symposium. I hope you really had an interesting morning. I definitely had. We really want to thank you and for joining us today, and invite you to lunch at the atrium. And I would especially ask you again for a warm hand for all our speakers today. So thank you.